The entire cafeteria went dead silent as Jax the Rhino's massive shadow swallowed Elias whole. At 320 pounds of pure muscle and tattooed rage, Jax was a mountain of a man who'd never heard the word no inside these walls. His voice rumbled like gravel scraping against metal. "You got two choices," Jax snarled, and then he slammed his palm down hard on Elias's breakfast tray. Gray oatmeal sloshed everywhere, splattering all over his orange jumpsuit. "You join me, or I make sure every day of your 5 years is worse than you can imagine. I'll have the new guys in the cell block taking turns on you. You'll beg me to unalive you by the end of the week." One of Jax's enforcers stepped forward and shoved Elias hard in the chest. But instead of stumbling backward like any normal man would, Elias didn't move an inch. His feet stayed planted on the ground, and his eyes stayed calm. That's when Jax knew something was very wrong. "I just want to eat my breakfast," Elias said quietly. Jax didn't waste another word. He drew back his fist and threw a punch that had ended men half his size. Everything he had went into that swing, and it was aimed straight at the quiet finance guy who'd just made the biggest mistake of his life. Hey, my people. If you're loving this story already, please hit that like button and comment where in the world you're watching from. Don't forget to subscribe to our storytelling channel because, trust me, this story is about to get wild. Now let's get back to Elias. His nightmare was just beginning, and you need to hear how he even ended up in this hell in the first place. 3 days earlier, the steel doors of Blackpine Maximum Security Penitentiary had slammed shut behind Elias Voss with a sound so loud it shook his teeth. At 43 years old, Elias was lean and sharp-jawed, and he carried himself with the kind of quiet stillness that made people forget he was even in the room. To the guards who were processing him that day, he looked like just another white-collar criminal, some corporate guy who got too greedy and took money that wasn't his. His paperwork said he was a former financial consultant who'd been sentenced to 5 years for embezzling $2.7 million from a corporate client. The guards barely looked at him twice as they fingerprinted him, photographed him, and handed him his orange jumpsuit. Just another number in the system, they figured. Nothing special about this one. But no one in that prison knew the truth, and that was exactly how it needed to be. Elias wasn't a financial consultant at all. He was a CIA deep cover operative, and he'd spent the last 21 years of his life doing jobs that would never make it into any official record. He'd been sent to Blackpine for one reason and one reason only: to dismantle a criminal enterprise that was operating both inside and outside the prison walls like some kind of twisted business empire. The intel that the agency had gathered over the past year was disturbing, to say the least. Someone inside Blackpine was running a massive operation that included drug smuggling across multiple states, contract hits on people who got in the way, and money laundering schemes that moved millions of dollars every single month. And the craziest part? The prison wardens were in on it. They were helping to make it all happen. Anyone who even thought about speaking up about the corruption ended up unalived. The deaths were always ruled as suicides or gang hits, and nobody asked questions because nobody wanted to be next. Elias's mission was simple on paper, but deadly in execution. He needed to gain the trust of the most powerful inmate in Blackpine, infiltrate his inner circle, and gather enough evidence to take down every single person involved, from the crime boss running the show to the corrupt wardens who were pulling strings from the outside. His target was a man named Jax the Rhino. At 48 years old, Jax was an absolute monster of a human being. He stood at 6 feet 6 inches tall and weighed 320 pounds of solid muscle. His neck and arms were covered in tattoos that told the story of his 25-year career in organized crime, and every single marking represented something violent or illegal he'd done. He'd been convicted of 5 major felonies: armed robbery, drug trafficking, racketeering, witness tampering, and 2 counts of murder for hire. The only reason Jax was behind bars at all was because some random bystander had filmed his latest hit and posted the video online. The public outcry had been so massive and so loud that even the judges on his payroll couldn't let him walk free this time. So they locked him up in Blackpine and threw away the key. But here's the thing that made Jax so dangerous. Inside Blackpine, he wasn't just another inmate. He was the king. Corrupt wardens had given him a private cell that looked more like a studio apartment than a prison cell. He had a flat-screen TV mounted on the wall, a mini fridge that was always stocked with craft beer, and he had unsupervised access to burner phones whenever he wanted. Jax controlled every single illegal racket inside the prison, from the Zaza trade to the protection schemes, and the guards looked the other way because he paid them 40% of everything he made. Inmates had 2 choices when it came to Jax. They could either join his crew and follow his orders, or they could disappear. And when I say disappear, I mean they ended up unalived in ways that looked like accidents, but everybody knew better. So yeah, Elias was walking into a lion's den, and the lion had a whole pack of hyenas working for him. For the first 3 days inside Blackpine, Elias played his role perfectly. He kept his head down and his mouth shut. He made his bunk slowly and carefully, like a man who was terrified of doing something wrong. He never looked anyone directly in the eye, and he only spoke when someone spoke to him first. To everyone watching, he looked like exactly what his paperwork said he was. A scared financial consultant who'd gotten in over his head and now had to survive 5 years in hell. His cellmate was a 19-year-old kid named Tyler, who'd been locked up for possession of just a few grams of Zaza. Tyler was skinny and nervous, and on the second night, he pulled Elias close and whispered something that made Elias's blood run cold. "Listen, man, you need to stay far away from Jax," Tyler said, his voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. "He's been asking questions about the new finance guy. Word is he wants to talk to you. And if he offers you a spot in his crew, you don't say no. You hear me? You don't ever say no to Jax." Tyler's eyes were wide with fear, and his hands trembled as he gripped Elias's sleeve. Last guy who turned him down was found face down in the shower 3 days later. The wardens said he slipped on soap, but everyone in here knows better. Everyone knows Jax had him unalived. Elias nodded slowly like he was taking the warning seriously, but he didn't say anything back. That night, after Tyler finally fell asleep, Elias got to work on the real reason he was there. He used a tiny magnetic pick that he'd hidden in the sole of his shoe to carefully pry loose a tile in the cell wall. Inside the small, hollow space behind it, he stashed a micro-audio recorder that was no bigger than a pencil eraser and a USB drive that was smaller than his thumbnail. The next morning, he made his way to the common room and accidentally brushed past one of Jax's enforcers, a wiry guy with a snake tattoo that coiled up the side of his neck. As Elias passed him, he stuck a second bug to the man's belt using a dab of industrial adhesive he'd hidden inside his toothpaste tube. It took less than 2 seconds, and the enforcer never even noticed. Now Elias was ready to listen. He was ready to gather evidence. He was ready to play the long game. But Jax had other plans, and those plans came crashing down on day 4. It happened in the cafeteria during breakfast. Elias was carrying a tray that had gray oatmeal on it and a cup of lukewarm coffee when the entire room suddenly went silent. He didn't even have to turn around to know who had just walked in. The air itself seemed to get heavier, like the temperature had dropped 10 degrees in a single second. Jax and his 6-man crew had positioned themselves between Elias and the only empty table in the back of the room. It was a power move, plain and simple. Everyone in that cafeteria knew what was about to happen, and they all looked away because nobody wanted to be a witness. Jax loomed over Elias like a skyscraper casting a shadow over a street. Up close, the man was even more terrifying than his reputation suggested. A thick scar split his left eyebrow in half, and his knuckles were raw and bloody from a recent beating he'd given to some inmate who'd tried to steal a shipment of Zaza that Jax was smuggling out of the prison. "Heard you're a numbers guy," Jax rumbled, his voice sounding like rocks being crushed in a blender. Used to cook books for big shots on the outside. Elias kept his face neutral, and his grip loose on the tray. He met Jax's eyes but didn't challenge him. "That's what they say," Elias replied calmly. Jax let out a bark of laughter, and his crew joined in like a pack of wolves howling at the moon. "Good, real good. See, I got use for a guy like you. My boys here are great at breaking bones and making people disappear, but they can't tell a ledger from a grocery list. You join me, and you launder the money from my shipments. You cook the books so the feds don't come sniffing around. And in return, you get better food than this garbage your own cell, and you don't end up floating in the sewage line behind the prison. Sound fair?" It was the opportunity Elias had been waiting for. This was his way in, but if he agreed too quickly, Jax would smell a rat. He had to play this perfectly. Elias hesitated for just a moment, then shook his head slowly. "I'm here to serve my time and keep my head down. I don't want any trouble." The laughter died instantly. Jax's eyes narrowed into dangerous slits, and the air in the cafeteria became suffocating. No one refused Jax. Not in Blackpine. Not ever. "Trouble finds you in here, pretty boy," Jax said, taking a step closer until Elias could smell the coffee on his breath. Then Jax slammed his massive palm down on Elias's tray so hard the whole thing jumped. Oatmeal sloshed over the edge and splattered all over Elias's orange jumpsuit, dripping down onto his shoes. "You got 2 choices. You join me, or I make sure every single day of your 5 years is worse than you can possibly imagine. I'll have the new guys in the cell block taking turns on you. You'll be begging me to unalive you by the end of the week. That's a promise." One of Jax's enforcers, the wiry man with the snake tattoo, stepped forward and shoved Elias hard in the chest with both hands. Most men would have stumbled backward and maybe even fallen, but Elias's training kicked in before his brain even had time to think about it. He shifted his weight to his back foot, absorbed the impact, and didn't move an inch. The enforcer blinked in surprise. Jax went completely still. For just a second, the entire cafeteria seemed to hold its breath. Tyler, who was huddled at a table across the room, squeezed his eyes shut because he couldn't bear to watch what was about to happen. Elias kept his voice calm and unthreatening, like he was negotiating a business deal over coffee. "I told you. I don't want to join. I just want to eat my breakfast." And that was the moment Jax snapped. He didn't waste another word. His right fist came flying back, and every single ounce of his 320 pounds went into a punch that had literally ended men half his size. The entire cafeteria was so quiet you could have heard a pin drop on the concrete floor. But Elias had seen the punch coming a full second before Jax even threw it. Years and years of close-quarters combat training had taught him how to read body language like most people read books. He saw the way Jax's shoulder tensed, the way his weight shifted to his front foot, the way his jaw clenched right before he committed to the swing. Elias ducked to the left, not too far, because that would look like he was trained, but just far enough to make Jax's fist sail harmlessly past his ear. As Jax stumbled forward off balance from the missed punch, Elias's elbow shot up in a controlled, precise movement and struck a pressure point just below Jax's ribcage. The air whooshed out of Jax like a balloon deflating. He doubled over and gasped for breath, his face turning purple as he struggled to pull oxygen into his lungs. The cafeteria was so silent now that you could hear a fork clatter on a table 3 rows over. Elias stepped back immediately and held up both hands like he was surrendering. "I was a high school wrestler back in the day," he said quickly. "Just reacted on instinct. I'm not looking for a fight, man. I promise." It was a lie, of course. But it was a good one. Jax straightened up about a minute later, and his eyes were burning with pure rage and humiliation. No one had ever laid a hand on him inside these walls, and lived to tell the story. But the entire cafeteria had just watched it happen. Every single inmate had seen Jax get dropped by a quiet finance guy who supposedly couldn't hurt a fly. If Jax unalived Elias right there in front of everyone, he'd draw way too much attention. Even his corrupt wardens couldn't cover up a murder in broad daylight with 100 witnesses watching. "Consider this a warning," Jax snarled, wiping spit from his lip with the back of his hand. His voice was low and deadly serious. "You've got 24 hours to change your mind and join my crew. Or you're dead." That's not a threat. That's a fact. He turned and walked away, his crew following behind him like loyal dogs. But Elias could feel Jax's eyes burning into the back of his skull even after he was gone. That night, the bug that Elias had planted on the enforcer's belt picked up something that confirmed his worst fears. Jax was in his private cell, talking on one of his burner phones to someone on the outside. "This finance guy's a real problem," Jax growled into the phone. "He's not as weak as he looks. Something's off about him. Keep an eye on him for me. And if he doesn't join me by tomorrow, we take him out in the laundry room. The cameras there are already disabled, and there won't be any witnesses. Make it look like an accident." The voice on the other end of the phone belonged to Warden Hale, the head of Blackpine and Jax's top inside contact. "I'll make sure the guards are nowhere near the laundry room tomorrow afternoon. You handle the rest." Elias lay in his bunk that night, staring at the ceiling while Tyler snored softly in the bed below. He knew he was running out of time faster than he'd anticipated. He'd gathered enough audio recordings to prove that Jax was running smuggling operations and planning hits, but he still didn't have the one thing he needed most: direct proof that the wardens were involved. Intel suggested that Jax kept a laptop in his private cell. On that laptop were encrypted emails, bank transfer records, and photos of Jax meeting with Warden Hale and other corrupt guards. If Elias could get his hands on those files, he'd have everything he needed to bring down the entire operation. But getting into Jax's cell meant getting close to the most dangerous man in the prison. And after what had happened in the cafeteria, Jax was watching him like a hawk. The next morning, Elias made a decision that would either save his life or end it. He found Jax in the prison yard, surrounded by his crew. The moment Jax saw him approaching, a sick smile spread across his face. "I'll join you," Elias said before Jax could even open his mouth. "But I need full access to your financial records. I can't launder money if I'm working blind." Jax's smile widened. He thought he'd broken the stubborn little finance guy. He thought fear had finally won. "Smart choice, pretty boy. Real smart. Meet me in my cell tonight after dinner. I'll show you everything you need to see. And don't even think about trying anything stupid. The guards are watching every move you make." Elias nodded slowly. Understood, but inside, his mind was already 10 steps ahead. Tonight would be the most dangerous night of his entire mission. He was walking straight into the lion's den with no backup and no way out if things went wrong. And something told him that Jax wasn't as convinced as he pretended to be. 2 guards escorted Elias down the dimly lit corridor toward Jax's private cell that night, and with every step he took, his heart pounded harder against his ribcage. The hallway smelled like industrial cleaner and something else Something metallic and wrong that he couldn't quite place. His hands didn't shake, though, because he couldn't afford to show even a hint of fear. Not now. Not when he was this close. The guards didn't say a single word to him as they walked. They just stared straight ahead with blank expressions on their faces like they were escorting him to his execution, and they'd done this exact same walk 100 times before. And honestly, maybe they had. When they finally reached Jax's cell, one of the guards knocked twice on the heavy metal door and then stepped back. The door swung open from the inside, and Elias got his first real look at how Jax was living while the rest of the inmates were packed into concrete boxes like animals. It was nothing like a prison cell. Nothing at all. There was a leather couch pushed against one wall that looked like it had been stolen from someone's living room. A flat-screen TV was mounted on the opposite wall, and a gaming console sat on a shelf below it with controllers and games stacked neatly beside it. In the corner was a mini-fridge that was humming softly, and on top of it sat a laptop on a rickety wooden table that looked completely out of place among all the expensive stuff. Jax was sitting on the couch with his back to Elias, drinking a beer like he was relaxing at home after a long day of work. He didn't even turn around when Elias walked in. "Files are on the laptop," Jax said, his voice casual and unbothered. "Password is Rhino 1975. Don't touch anything else, and we won't have a problem." The guards closed the door behind Elias with a heavy clang that echoed through the cell. He was alone now with the most dangerous man in Blackpine, and there was no one coming to save him if things went sideways. Elias walked over to the table slowly and sat down in the cheap plastic chair that was positioned in front of the laptop. He opened it up, typed in the password, and the screen came to life with folders and files scattered all over the desktop. His trained eyes immediately started scanning for what he needed. There were spreadsheets with fake construction company names that Jax was using to launder money. There were encrypted email threads between Jax and people on the outside coordinating drug shipments. There were photos of Jax meeting with men in expensive suits who were clearly not inmates. And buried in one folder labeled transfers were bank records showing payments being made to multiple prison guards every single month. This was it. This was everything the agency needed. Elias pretended to scroll through the spreadsheet slowly like he was just a finance guy trying to understand the system. But while he did that, he casually reached up and adjusted his glasses, sliding them down his nose just a little bit. Taped to the inside of the left lens was a micro USB drive that was so small you'd never notice it unless you knew exactly what to look for. He pulled the drive free and plugged it into the hidden side port of the laptop where Jax wouldn't see it from his position on the couch. Then he hit copy on the most important folders and watched as the progress bar started moving. The drive was designed to encrypt the files automatically and send a backup to his handler's server that was over 500 miles away from this prison. 30 seconds. That's all he needed. Just 30 seconds, and he'd have enough evidence to bring down this entire operation. 20 seconds. Elias kept his breathing steady and his face neutral. He clicked on another spreadsheet to make it look like he was working. 15 seconds. Behind him, Jax took another long sip of his beer. The sound was so loud in the quiet cell that it made Elias's nerves scream. 10 seconds. "You know," Jax said suddenly, breaking the silence, "I had Warden Hale run a background check on you this morning." Elias's blood turned to ice in his veins. Every muscle in his body tensed up, but he forced himself to stay calm and keep staring at the laptop screen. "Why?" he asked, keeping his voice as casual as possible. 5 seconds. Jax stood up from the couch and turned around slowly. That's when Elias saw it, the gun in Jax's hand. It was small and black, a smuggled pistol that had probably been hidden in the cushion of the couch this whole time. "Because no one who can dodge my punch and take me down in front of the whole cafeteria was just a high school wrestler," Jax said, his voice dripping with venom. "And you want to know what else I found out? The company you supposedly embezzled from? It never existed. There's no record of it anywhere. Nice try. Fed." The file transfer hit 100%, and Elias heard the tiny click as the USB drive finished its job. But he didn't move. He didn't reach for it. He just sat there and stared at Jax like a man who'd just been caught in the biggest lie of his life. The cell door suddenly slammed open behind him with a deafening bang. Jax's entire crew filed in 6 men, all of them carrying makeshift weapons. There were shivs that had been carved from toothbrushes and sharpened until they could pierce skin. There were metal pipes that had been stolen from the maintenance shop, and every single one of those men looked at Elias like he was already dead. Warden Hale stepped into the doorway last, and the smirk on his face made Elias want to punch him. Hale was in his 50s with graying hair and a beer gut, and he looked like the kind of man who'd sell out his own mother if the price was right. "CIA, right?" Hale said, crossing his arms over his chest. "Real cute. You think we haven't had feds try to infiltrate us before?" Every single one of them ended up in the same place. Unmarked grave, about 10 miles west of the prison where nobody ever goes looking. Elias's mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles per hour. He'd gotten the files. The evidence was already on its way to his handler. But if he didn't make it out of this cell alive, none of that would matter, because he'd never be able to testify about what he'd seen. He needed to buy time. He needed to make them second-guess themselves. "You're making a huge mistake," Elias said, his voice steady and calm like he was explaining something to a child. "I sent a copy of every single file I've gathered so far to my handler on the outside. If I don't check in at exactly 9 p.m. sharp tonight, that evidence gets sent automatically to the FBI, the DOJ, and every major news outlet in the country. You'll all spend the rest of your miserable lives in a supermax cell with no windows, no craft beer, no private TVs, just concrete walls and regret." Hale laughed, a harsh, ugly sound that echoed off the walls. "Nice bluff. Fed. But your handler doesn't even know you're here right now, so there's no way." His phone buzzed in his pocket. Hale's laugh died in his throat. He pulled out his phone slowly and looked at the screen, and Elias watched as every drop of color drained from the warden's face. His hand started shaking as he opened an email that had just come through. The subject line read, "Blackpine Evidence Backup." Attached to the email was a preview of the bank transfers showing Hale's personal account receiving $25,000 every single month from one of Jax's shell companies. It was right there in black and white, and there was no way to deny it. Elias allowed himself the smallest hint of a smile. "Told you," he said quietly. Jax roared with rage and charged forward, raising the gun like he was going to pistol whip Elias into the ground. But Elias was already moving. He grabbed the laptop off the table and swung it with all his strength into the face of the nearest enforcer. The man's nose exploded in a spray of crimson, and he crumpled to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut. Before anyone else could react, Elias dove for the metal pipe that had fallen from the enforcer's hands. He spun and cracked it hard against the knee of the next attacker, and the man went down screaming and clutching his leg. This wasn't a bar fight. This wasn't some street brawl between gangbangers. This was a CIA operative fighting for his life, and he fought like one. Elias moved with precision and speed that came from years of training. He drove his elbow into one man's solar plexus and watched him fold in half, gasping for air. He disarmed another attacker and used the man's own shiv to jam into the electronic lock on the cell door, shorting it out so reinforcements couldn't get in. He dodged a wild swing from Jax's pistol and used the momentum to send another enforcer crashing into the wall. Jax charged at him like a bull, roaring and swinging the gun wildly. But Elias sidestepped at the last possible second and used Jax's own momentum against him. The massive man went crashing face first into the concrete wall with a sickening thud, and the pistol clattered out of his hand and skidded across the floor. Elias kicked the gun away before Jax could reach for it. Then he drove his heel down hard into the pressure point behind Jax's knee, the same technique that could drop even the biggest men. Jax crumpled to the ground, howling in pain and clutching his leg. That's when Elias heard it. Sirens. But not the prison's alarms. These were different. These were federal tactical sirens, and they were getting louder by the second. "Looks like my check-in was late," Elias said, breathing hard but standing tall over Jax's writhing body. "My handler doesn't like to wait." The cell door exploded inward as FBI SWAT agents breached the room with their rifles raised and their red laser sights dancing across everyone's chests. "FBI, get on the ground. Hands where we can see them." Jax and his crew didn't move fast enough, so the agents tackled them to the ground and zip-tied their hands behind their backs. Warden Hale tried to run, but two agents caught him in the hallway and slammed him against the wall so hard his teeth rattled. One of the SWAT team leaders walked over to Elias and gave him a quick once-over. "You good, Agent Voss?" Elias nodded, wiping crimson liquid from his split lip. "Yeah, I'm good. Got everything we need on that laptop." Within minutes, the entire cell block was swarming with federal agents. Inmates were being pulled out of their cells and questioned. Guards who were on Jax's payroll were being arrested and dragged out in handcuffs. And Jax himself was being loaded onto a transport vehicle that would take him to a facility where he'd never see daylight again. But Elias didn't stick around to watch. He had one more thing to do before this mission was truly over. "Hey fam, can you believe what just went down?" Elias literally fought his way out of certain death and brought down an entire criminal empire in one night. If you're on the edge of your seat right now, smash that like button and drop a comment telling me what you think happens next. And please, subscribe to our storytelling channel because this story is far from over. Now let's see what Elias does next, because trust me, this man's got one more move to make. 2 hours later, Elias was standing outside Tyler's cell with a guard by his side. The young kid was sitting on his bunk looking terrified because he thought he was about to get transferred or punished for something he didn't do. "Tyler," Elias said gently, "come with me." Tyler followed him down the corridor in silence until they reached an office where 2 FBI agents were waiting. One of them handed Tyler a folder. "Your case has been reviewed," the agent said. "Possession of a small amount of Zaza as a first-time offender shouldn't have landed you in a maximum security prison. You were placed here because someone wanted cheap labor and didn't care about the law. Your sentence is being overturned effective immediately. You're free to go." Tyler's mouth fell open. Tears started streaming down his face as he looked at Elias with wide, disbelieving eyes. You did this?" Elias put a hand on the kid's shoulder. "You helped me by warning me about Jax. The least I could do was make sure you didn't spend the next few years of your life in a place you never should have been in the first place. Go home, Tyler. Get your life back on track." Tyler hugged him so hard Elias thought his ribs might crack. When the kid finally let go, he was led out by the agents toward the processing area where he'd get his civilian clothes back and walk out a free man. Elias watched him go and felt something close to satisfaction settle in his chest. This was why he did this job. Not for the glory or the adrenaline, but for moments like this where he could actually make a difference in someone's life. 3 days later, Elias walked out of Blackpine Maximum Security Penitentiary as a free man himself. His cover identity had been completely erased from the system. As far as anyone knew, the finance guy who'd embezzled millions never existed at all. 12 people had been arrested in total. Jax and his entire inner circle, Warden Hale and 3 other corrupt guards, and 4 of Jax's outside associates who'd been coordinating the hits and smuggling operations from the outside. The evidence Elias had gathered was so airtight that not a single one of them would ever see the outside of a prison cell again. They were all sentenced to life in Supermax facilities with no possibility of parole. No craft beer, no private cells, no TVs or gaming consoles. Just 23 hours a day in a concrete box with nothing but their regrets to keep them company. As Elias stepped through the final gate and breathed in the fresh air of freedom, a black SUV pulled up beside him. The back door opened, and his handler, a woman in her 50s named Patricia, with sharp eyes and graying hair pulled back in a tight bun, handed him a cup of coffee that was still steaming hot. "Good work in there," Patricia said as Elias climbed into the SUV. "You took down one of the most powerful prison criminal enterprises in the country. The director is very impressed." Elias took a long sip of the coffee and let the warmth spread through his chest. It was the first decent coffee he'd had in over a week, and it tasted like heaven. "Just doing my job." Patricia smiled, but it didn't reach her eyes. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a thick manila folder, then dropped it on Elias's lap. "Well, your job isn't done yet. We've got a new mission for you." Elias opened the folder and started reading. His eyes scanned over surveillance photos, intelligence reports, and detailed maps of a facility that was thousands of miles away from where they were right now. "There's a cartel operating out of Colombia," Patricia explained. "They've been using a women's prison as a smuggling hub for the past 2 years. Drugs, weapons, even human trafficking. The local authorities either can't stop them or won't stop them because they're being paid off. We need someone on the inside to gather evidence and bring the whole operation down from within." Elias looked up from the folder. "A women's prison?" Patricia nodded. "You'll be going in as a new warden who's been hired to clean up the facility's reputation. It's going to be dangerous, Elias. Maybe even more dangerous than Blackpine. These people don't just threaten you. They go after your family, your friends, anyone you've ever cared about. Are you up for it?" Elias closed the folder and leaned back in his seat. He thought about Jax and the 6 men who'd tried to unalive him in that cell. He thought about Warden Hale and the corruption that had poisoned Blackpine from the inside out. And he thought about Tyler walking out of those gates as a free man because someone had finally stood up and done the right thing. "When do I leave?" Elias asked. Patricia smiled, a real smile this time. 2 weeks. That should give you enough time to recover and get briefed on the details. Think you can handle it? Elias looked out the window as the SUV pulled away from Blackpine Penitentiary. The building grew smaller and smaller in the distance until it finally disappeared behind the trees. Somewhere inside those walls, inmates were probably already whispering about the quiet finance guy who'd taken down the Rhino and walked out alive. But Elias didn't care about legends or reputations. He cared about justice. He cared about making sure that people like Jackson Hale never got away with destroying innocent lives. "Yeah," Elias said quietly. "I can handle it." The SUV merged onto the highway and headed south toward the agency's headquarters. Patricia handed him another folder, this one even thicker than the first, and Elias started reading through the details of his next mission. But as he read, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. Blackpine had been dangerous, sure. But Colombia? A cartel-run women's prison with connections to international trafficking rings. That was going to be a whole different level of hell. and Elias had a feeling that this next mission might be the one that finally broke him. 2 weeks later, Elias stepped off a private jet at a small airstrip outside Bogotá, Colombia, and the humidity hit him like a wall of wet heat. The air was thick and heavy, and even though it was barely 8 in the morning, sweat was already starting to bead on his forehead. He was wearing an expensive gray suit and carrying a leather briefcase that made him look exactly like what he was supposed to be, a high-level prison administrator brought in from the United States to reform a corrupt facility. But as he walked across the tarmac toward the black sedan that was waiting for him, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. And not just by the 2 Colombian agents who were supposed to be his escorts. There were eyes everywhere in this country, and most of them belonged to people who didn't want reform anywhere near their operations. The driver was a short man with a thick mustache who introduced himself as Agent Ramirez. He didn't smile or offer small talk as Elias climbed into the back seat. He just started the engine and pulled out onto the dusty road that would take them to Santa Rosa Women's Correctional Facility. "How much do you know about where you're going?" Ramirez asked after about 10 minutes of uncomfortable silence. Elias had spent the last 2 weeks studying every single detail about Santa Rosa, so he knew plenty. But he played it cool and kept his answer vague. "I know it's got a reputation for being poorly managed and that there have been complaints about corruption. That's why I'm here, to clean things up and restore order." Ramirez let out a bitter laugh that had no humor in it whatsoever. "Corruption. That's one way to put it. Santa Rosa isn't just poorly managed, Senor Voss. It's owned by the Morales cartel. The warden, the guards, even some of the inmates. They all work for the cartel in one way or another. And anyone who tries to change that ends up unalived before they can make a difference." Elias looked out the window at the lush green mountains that surrounded the road on both sides. It was beautiful country, but he knew that beauty could hide some of the darkest evil imaginable. "How many wardens have tried to reform the place?" 3 in the last 5 years, Ramirez said quietly. The first one lasted 6 months before he was found in his office with a bullet in his head. They ruled it a suicide, but everybody knew better. The second one made it 3 months before his car exploded on his way home from work. The third one was smarter. He took the cartel's money and looked the other way. He's still alive, but he's not a warden anymore. He's just another puppet. Elias nodded slowly, absorbing the information. This was exactly what Patricia had warned him about. The Morales cartel didn't play games, and they didn't give second chances. If they even suspected that Elias was anything other than what he appeared to be, they'd eliminate him without hesitation. "So what makes you think you'll survive?" Ramirez asked, glancing at Elias in the rearview mirror. Elias met his eyes and gave him a small, confident smile. "Because I'm not here to be a hero. I'm here to do a job, and I'm very good at my job." That wasn't entirely true, of course. Elias was absolutely here to be a hero. He was here to dismantle the cartel's operation from the inside and free the women who were being used as pawns in their trafficking schemes. But Ramirez didn't need to know that. The fewer people who knew the truth about Elias's mission, the better his chances of survival. They drove for another hour through winding mountain roads until they finally reached Santa Rosa. The facility was surrounded by high concrete walls topped with razor wire, and armed guards stood at every corner watching the road with cold, calculating eyes. It looked more like a military compound than a correctional facility, and Elias knew immediately that this place was going to be 10 times harder to infiltrate than Blackpine had been. Ramirez pulled up to the main gate and rolled down his window. One of the guards approached with his hand resting casually on the pistol at his hip. "State your business," the guard said in Spanish. "This is the new warden," Ramirez replied, also in Spanish. "Elias Voss. He's here to take over operations starting today." The guard looked at Elias with suspicion written all over his face. He studied him for a long moment before finally nodding and waving them through. The gate creaked open slowly, and the sedan rolled into the compound. As they drove toward the main administrative building, Elias took note of everything he saw. There were women in orange jumpsuits working in the yard under the watchful eyes of guards who carried rifles. Some of the women looked exhausted and beaten down, like they'd given up hope a long time ago. Others had a hardness in their eyes that suggested they'd learned to survive by becoming just as ruthless as the people who controlled them. Ramirez parked in front of a squat concrete building and turned around to face Elias. "This is where I leave you. My job was just to get you here safely. From this point on, you're on your own. And Senor Voss? Be very careful who you trust in there. The cartel has people everywhere, and they'll know if you're not who you say you are." Elias grabbed his briefcase and stepped out of the car. "Thanks for the ride, Agent Ramirez. I'll take it from here." Ramirez drove away without another word, and Elias was left standing alone in front of the building. He took a deep breath, straightened his tie, and walked through the front door like he owned the place. "Anyway, fam, I need you to understand something right now. Elias just walked into the most dangerous situation of his entire career, and he's completely alone. No backup, No safety net, just him against an entire cartel. If you're feeling that tension, go ahead and hit that like button and comment what country you're watching from. Subscribe to our storytelling channel so you don't miss what happens next, because believe me, things are about to get insane. Now let's get back to Elias. His first day at Santa Rosa was about to take a very dark turn. The inside of the administrative building was surprisingly clean and modern compared to the harsh exterior. There was a receptionist sitting behind a desk who looked up when Elias walked in. She was young, maybe mid-20s, with dark hair pulled back in a ponytail and eyes that looked tired despite her age. "You must be Warden Voss," she said in accented English. "I'm Maria. I'll be your assistant. Director Alvarez is waiting for you in his office." Elias followed her down a narrow hallway, lined with filing cabinets and fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead. She knocked twice on a heavy wooden door at the end of the hall, and a voice from inside called out for them to enter. Director Alvarez was a tall man in his 50s with silver hair slicked back and a suit that probably cost more than most people in Colombia made in a year. He stood up from behind his desk and extended his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Warden Voss, welcome to Santa Rosa," Alvarez said smoothly. "We're very pleased to have someone of your caliber joining our team. I trust your journey was comfortable?" Elias shook his hand and noted the firm grip and the expensive watch on Alvarez's wrist. This was a man who was getting paid very well by someone, and Elias would bet his life it wasn't the Colombian government. "The journey was fine, thank you. I'm eager to get started and see how I can help improve operations here." Alvarez gestured for Elias to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. "I appreciate your enthusiasm, but I should be honest with you from the start. Santa Rosa has some unique challenges that you won't find in American facilities. The inmates here come from very difficult backgrounds, and many of them have connections to dangerous organizations on the outside. Your job will be to maintain order and ensure the facility runs smoothly, but you must also understand that there are certain realities here that cannot be changed." Elias leaned back in his chair and studied Alvarez carefully. "What kind of realities are we talking about?" Alvarez's smile widened just a fraction. "Let's just say that Santa Rosa operates under a different set of rules than what you might be used to. There are certain arrangements in place that benefit everyone involved: the inmates, the guards, the administration. As long as you don't disrupt these arrangements, you'll find that your time here will be very peaceful and very profitable." There it was, the cartel's offer delivered with a smile and wrapped in polite language. Join them, look the other way, and get rich. Or refuse and end up like the three wardens before him. Elias kept his expression neutral and professional. "I'm here to do my job, Director Alvarez. I follow the law, and I expect everyone under my supervision to do the same. If there are problems with how this facility has been run in the past, then we'll address them together and make the necessary changes." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Alvarez's smile vanished completely, and his eyes turned cold and calculating. "I see. Well, I hope you understand that change can be very dangerous in a place like this. The previous warden who tried to make changes found that out the hard way. I'm aware of what happened to my predecessors," Elias said calmly, "but I'm not afraid of doing what's right, even when it's difficult. That's why I was hired for this position." Alvarez stood up slowly and walked over to the window that overlooked the prison yard. "You Americans always think you can come down here and fix everything with your rules and your righteousness. But this isn't America, Warden Voss. This is Colombia, and things work very differently here. I strongly suggest you take some time to observe how things are done before you start making any changes. For your own safety." It was a threat disguised as friendly advice, and they both knew it. Elias stood up and grabbed his briefcase. "I appreciate your concern, Director. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like to tour the facility and meet some of the staff and inmates. I need to get a sense of how things operate here." Alvarez turned away from the window and gave him a look that was equal parts pity and annoyance. "Maria will give you a tour. But remember what I said, Warden. Some doors are better left unopened." As Elias walked out of the office with Maria leading the way, he felt Alvarez's eyes burning into his back. The message had been delivered loud and clear: play along or suffer the consequences. But Elias hadn't come all this way to play along. He'd come to tear down the entire operation, and he wasn't going to let threats stop him. Maria led him through the facility, showing him the cell blocks, the cafeteria, the medical wing, and the recreation yard. Everything looked clean and organized on the surface, but Elias's trained eyes picked up on the little details that told the real story. Guards who were too relaxed and chatted openly with certain inmates. Locked doors that shouldn't be locked. Rooms that Maria conveniently skipped during the tour. "What's behind that door?" Elias asked, pointing to a heavy metal door at the end of a dimly lit corridor in the basement level. Maria's face went pale. "That's just storage, Warden. Nothing important. Then you won't mind if we take a look, Elias said, walking toward the door before she could stop him. Wait, please. Maria grabbed his arm, her voice desperate. You can't go in there. It's against the rules. Elias turned to face her and saw genuine fear in her eyes. Not fear of him, but fear of what would happen if he opened that door. Who made that rule, Maria? Director Alvarez? She nodded quickly, tears starting to form in her eyes. Please, Warden Voss, if you go in there, they'll punish me. They'll hurt me. Just leave it alone. Elias felt his chest tighten with anger, but he forced himself to stay calm. He gently removed her hand from his arm and gave her what he hoped was a reassuring look. I'm not going to let anyone hurt you, Maria. I promise, but I need to see what's behind that door. Before she could protest again, Elias pulled out the master keyring that Alvarez had given him during their meeting. He found the right key, slid it into the lock, and turned it. The door opened with a heavy groan, and the smell that hit him made his stomach turn. Inside the room were stacks and stacks of plastic-wrapped packages. Elias didn't need to open them to know what they contained. This was the cartel's stash. Pounds and pounds of Zaza waiting to be smuggled out of the prison and distributed across the country and beyond. But that wasn't the worst part. In the back corner of the room, huddled together on thin mattresses on the cold concrete floor, were 3 young women who looked barely older than teenagers. They were thin and dirty, their eyes hollow and empty like they'd been broken down into nothing. These weren't inmates. These were trafficking victims. Elias's blood ran cold, and his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This was worse than he'd imagined. The cartel wasn't just using Santa Rosa as a smuggling hub. They were using it as a holding facility for women who'd been kidnapped and forced into trafficking. Get them out of here, Elias said to Maria, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Get them to the medical wing right now. I want them examined, fed, and given clean clothes. Do you understand me? Maria nodded frantically, too scared to argue. She helped the 3 women to their feet and led them out of the room while Elias stood there staring at the packages of Zaza and feeling his mission shift into something far more urgent. He pulled out his phone and sent a single encrypted text message to Patricia. Situation worse than expected. Trafficking confirmed. Need extraction plan for victims ASAP. The response came back less than a minute later. Understood. Proceed with caution. You're on your own until we can coordinate with local authorities. Elias pocketed his phone and took one last look at the room before closing the door and locking it again. He knew what he'd just done would have consequences. Director Alvarez would find out within hours that Elias had discovered the storage room and moved the victims. And when that happened, the cartel would come for him. But Elias didn't care. He'd spent his entire career fighting people who preyed on the innocent, and he wasn't about to stop now just because the enemy was more dangerous than usual. As he walked back upstairs toward his new office, he heard footsteps behind him, heavy, purposeful footsteps that belonged to men who weren't trying to be quiet. He turned around and saw 4 guards approaching with expressions that made it clear they weren't there to welcome him. The lead guard was a massive man with a shaved head and a scar that ran from his ear to his chin. He stopped about 10 feet away from Elias and crossed his arms over his chest. Director Alvarez wants to see you, the guard said in heavily accented English. Right now. Elias straightened his tie and met the man's gaze without flinching. Tell Director Alvarez I'll be there in 5 minutes. I need to secure my office first. The guard took a step forward, his hand moving toward the pistol at his hip. That wasn't a request, Warden. It was an order. Elias knew he was outnumbered and outgunned. These men weren't here to escort him. They were here to intimidate him, and possibly worse. But if he backed down now, he'd lose any chance of maintaining control over the situation. I don't take orders from guards, Elias said calmly. I give them. Now step aside and let me do my job, or we're going to have a serious problem. For a moment, nobody moved. The tension in the hallway was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Elias could see the guard's hand twitching near his weapon. One wrong move and this whole thing could explode into violence. Then, from behind the guards, a woman's voice cut through the silence like a knife. Is there a problem here?